Hello, welcome back. We are now going to be talking about chapter 12, which is going to be the bodies section of our bugs, bodies, and bones unit. All right, so chapter 12 is death, matter, mechanism, and cause. And in this unit, these are the things that we will be expected to know how to do. All right, so the distinguish between cellular death and death of an organism, the four manners of death, which we have natural death, we have accidental, suicidal, and homicidal. And the fifth classification, which is going to be undetermined. We're going to be able to distinguish between manner and mechanism of death. They don't mean the same things. They are not synonyms. And we're going to outline the sequence of events that occurs in just the first few minutes after death. We're also going to be able to define and explain agar, rigor, and livor mortis. We call those the mortices, and we'll talk about those in this presentation. And we're going to talk about the physical and chemical changes and during the decomposition process, including autolysis, putrefaction, marbling, and adipocere formation. And we'll be able to analyze the evidence from agar, liver, and rigor mortis, the mortices, stomach contents, and decomposition, along with some environmental factors to estimate a post-mortem interval, which we talked about. Remember, post-mortem interval is PMI, right? We talked about that in our entomology notes. Are going to be able to compare and contrast the roles of a medical examiner and a coroner. They are not the same thing. Okay, so these are not synonyms. The procedures of an autopsy and examples of how an autopsy helps establish the cause, manner, and the postmortem interval. And we're going to be able to support the claim that it's often difficult to pinpoint the postmortem interval. The vocabulary in this unit, which you will have a quiz on, of course, the vocabulary. Agar mortis, right? We have our mortices, and right, we have our agar mortis, our liver mortis, and our rigor mortis. So I think those are the three trickiest words to figure out. And then differentiating between cause of death and manner of death and mechanism of death. And then the differentiating between the coroner and the medical examiner. You probably know what autopsy is already. And putrefaction just sounds exactly like it is something that is putrid and putrefied. All right, so a death of an individual body cells is a slow process, right? So it is a slow process. This is not something that happens in 10 minutes. It does not occur at the exact moment the heart or brain stops. A single definition of death is something that experts still debate, right? Because we have when the heart stops, right? And we also have, I'm sorry, I'm using my finger as a pen. When we have the heart stops, and again, this touchscreen is not very good, so I'm going to just get to my erase button here. And I'm going to go to this eraser, and we're going to just erase this gibberish, whatever I wrote here. All right, so the cause of death is something that is still debatable, right? So the exact definition of death, right? Because we basically have when the heart stops, right? So our heart stops. And then we also have something that's called brain death. So establishing that postmortem interval, right? We talked about that with our little critters, with the bugs, which is the time between death, right? So, and then the body discovery, right? So when was the body discovered, right? That postmortem interval. Post meaning after, mortem meaning death, and interval meaning time frame. So our official terms for the manner of death. Okay, so this is the manner of death. So this is where we just basically is just a classify, right? This is just how we're going to classify death. And it's either going to be classified as natural, accidental, suicidal, homicidal, or undetermined, right? Those are the only classifications that are going to go on a death certificate. So the cause of death is the reason someone dies. The mechanism of death describes the specific change in the body that brought about the cessation of life, right? The cause of death describes the event, right? So cause of death describes the event that led to the person's death. So for example, a hanging would be a cause of death. All right, so on your death certificate, right, this is an official death certificate, can list the cause of death and sometimes the mechanism of death. Remember, the cause of death and mechanism not the same. All right, so death is a sequence of events that affects some cells sooner than others. So in the first stage of death is the stoppage, right? So that is when blood stops circulating through the body and cellular activity stops. So then the second stage is autolysis or cell self-destruction, right? So that's what autolysis means, right? The cells start destructing, right? And they self-digest. That means they break down, fluids leak out, right? And producing some of the leakage of decomposition. Algor mortis, postmortem interval, estimates can be accurate for deaths. Did I skip a slide? Let me double check because I feel like I might have. Nope. Okay. Within the past 24 hours, if the corpse has not been subject to unusual heat loss conditions, right? So Algor mortis has to do with the temperature. For the first 12 hours after death, all right, the body is going to cool. And why does it cool? Because the heart is no longer pumping and we are no longer having a metabolism that produces heat for us, right? And so at a 0.78 degrees Celsius per hour, that is just an estimate because remember, in extreme cold or extreme heat, that's going to be different depending on the environmental conditions. After the first 12 hours, the body cools at about 0.39 degrees Celsius per hour until the body reaches the same temperature as whatever the surrounding temperature would be. If it's a 70-degree Fahrenheit day, eventually that body is going to become the same temperature at 70 degrees. And these rates are an estimate and may vary. And again, they vary depending on the environmental conditions. So now we have livor mortis, right? And that has to do with lividity, right? And that becomes noticeable about 2 hours after death. The discoloration becomes permanent after 8 hours, right? So this is what we call livor mortis, right? This is the pooling of the blood. Okay, so this is where pooling of the blood occurs. So if you see this livor mortis along the underside of a victim, right, then this is going to mean that that victim died laying flat down because, right, all the blood is going to pool. So if you see this discoloration on the top surface of a body, if you saw it up here, we would know that the body would have been moved or flipped over because remember the blood is going to pool, right, based on what? Based on gravity. Right, so livor mortis, right, is a discoloration, right, and that becomes permanent after 8 hours. So now we have rigor mortis, right? This is probably something that you have seen in CSI shows where they're like, oh yeah, rigor mortis is set in. They don't usually mention the livor mortis or the algor mortis quite as much on TV because it just, I think, is more confusing to audiences, right? And audiences connect with the whole rigor mortis. And it usually becomes apparent within 2 hours after death, right? So then it's basically known where the muscles get really stiff. Right? If you see roadkill along the side of the road and you see their legs sticking up like that, right? That's going to be what we call rigor mortis. And that happens about 2 hours after death. And it progresses from the smaller muscle groups to the larger muscle groups, right? And it's a progression. So after 12 hours, the body is at its most rigid state, right? That will be what we will call full rigor mortis. So then again, you can figure out a postmortem interval, right, based on what degree of rigor mortis there is in a victim, right? So between 2 to 6 hours, you have that rigor beginning, right? The small muscles are going to be the ones that are going to start. And then, right, such as the face, right? So the face is not going to be as flexible and able to move. Then progressing to the larger muscle groups, right? So your larger muscle groups are going to be the last to experience rigor mortis. And about 12 hours, right, rigor is complete. The body is completely rigid. So then what happens after we have full rigor mortis is now we have a slowing, right? So we have the slow loss of rigor right? And so then it's lost in those smaller muscles again and later in the larger muscles. And then after 36 to 48 hours, right, they're going to have complete muscle relaxation, right? So your body is working all the time, not to contract your muscles, but your body is constantly working to relax your muscles. And so once the heart stops pumping and the brain stops sending signals, what happens is your body no longer is working to keep your muscles relaxed, right? So then that's why you have that stiffening of the body after death, right? And then of course the smaller muscles are going to be affected earlier because, right, they're going to be much smaller in mass. The factors that are going to affect rigor mortis, right? So temperature inhibits rigor, right? What does the word inhibit mean? Inhibit means like prevent, right? So it's going to be slower onset with the colder temperatures, right? So a body, found outside in an alley on a minus 20 degree Fahrenheit day, right, is going to have a slower onset of rigor mortis. The activity before death, right? So if it was, let's say there was a runner, right, that's going to accelerate rigor, right? And that's because of the lack of oxygen to the muscles, building up of that lactic acid, right? So when you feel those muscles burn, that's lactic acid. And a higher body temperature, right, that's going to accelerate the rigor, right? Warmer temperatures are going to accelerate. Accelerate means faster. Sleep is going to end up slowing rigor, right? Because you've got fully oxygenated muscles, right? So that's going to be more slowly if someone's like, something happens in the sleep, right? And sometimes, remember, death also can be natural and not always a homicide. And then body mass. So obesity is going to slow rigor because of the fat stores in the oxygen. And somebody that's on the thinner side is going to undergo rigor much more quickly. So those are the factors that affect rigor mortis. Remember, rigor means the stiffening, right? So rigor mortis is the stiffening of the muscles. So now in an autopsy, we have a medical, which is just basically, it's a medical examination. So basically it's a, after death physical to determine the cause and the manner of death. Clinical autopsies are done for medical research studies purposes, and foul play is not considered. Forensic autopsies, right? So there's two different things, right? So they want to basically, this is like, hey, we need to figure out what happened in this strange, situation, this strange whatever. That's not going to be the same type of autopsy as a forensic autopsy. A forensic autopsy is performed when foul play is suspected, right? And then, of course, you need to have that external examination, right? So you're looking basically here, we're looking for, I have to erase because, again, with my awful handwriting down here. Let me get my eraser. Okay, there we go. And let's get that pen back. Super small on my screen. Okay. And pen. Okay. So the external examination, again, we're looking for trace evidence, right? What were some of the trace evidence we used to see that we've already talked about this year, right? We're looking for hair and we're looking for fibers. And something we have not yet talked about, or maybe we have, depending on what year, DNA. And again, then we're going to look at the internal examination, right? And we're going to look at basically every organ. Oops. And I just, and you can see my use of technology. Okay. And again, the internal examination, we're going to look at the internal organs. All right, the stomach and intestinal contents are very important, right? They're going to be able to give clues as to where a victim has been or not have been, or a suspect, right? So they can use that to also connect a suspect to a victim, and they're also going to be able to use that to trace the movements of a victim, right? Tracing the movements of a victim is very important, and that's what's, the good solid police work that solves the crimes. It's not always the forensics, right? Good solid police work is really the most important thing. So within 2 to 6 hours, the stomach empties its contents into the small intestine. Right here's your stomach. I have to get my pen back. Okay, a little anatomy, right? You've got your stomach, and then the food is going to reside in your stomach for about 2 to 6 hours, and then it's going to empty into your small intestines, which are, right down here. So if, you see a lot of food in the stomach, that hasn't been digested. You can say that within 2 to 6 hours, the person ate that food. Within 12 more hours, right? So that's in addition to the 2 to 6, food leaves the small intestine and then it goes into the large intestine. And then with about 24 hours, right, the wastes are released through the rectum, right? So that's the full digestion process, right? And so where the food is and the type of food and where it's located within the digestive system is going to give clues about our victim. And then we have our stages of decomposition. So we talked about our stages of rigor, right? And so now we're going to talk about the stages of decomposition. So the first stage of decomposition is what we call fresh, right? Initial. This is our first stage. And the corpse appears normal on the outside, right? It just looks like a person that's just lying there. Let's just assuming that it's not a crazy looking scene. But it's starting to decompose from the actions basically of bacteria, right? Because your body is made up of a lot of bacteria and autolysis, right? And the body temperature is going to drop. And then this is where we have our bugs, right? Our insects come in, they lay eggs because the insects smell the gases produced by bacteria, right? The putrescine and the cadaverine. So then the odor of decaying flesh is now present in our bloating, or we call that the putrefaction stage. And the corpse is going to appear swollen, right? Swelling up, right? So it's kind of like an injury, swollen. The skin becomes marbled in color. So that means it's going to have some variation in color. It won't be just like a smooth one color. And it may split open from the collected gases. Remember, those bacteria are producing gases, and then we're going to have fluid seepage, and insect activity is going to increase in our putrefaction stage. And then after that, we have what we call the active decay, where now you're going to have a very strong odor of decomposition. The flesh is discolored. The skin is now rupturing from those gases, right? Because those gases have to go somewhere. And so the body's going to collapse while the seepage of fluid continues. Most of the body mass is lost to insect activity, because remember, those maggots are going to be eating the dead and decaying flesh. And then we have our next stage, which we call advanced decay. And this is where the corpse is starting to dry out. Most of the flesh is going to be gone. Adipocere is forming, and we have fewer insects remain. And then we have the dry. So this is, remember, where we had the beetles right towards the end. And then dry or skeletal, you're just going to have mostly bones, right? Those are the stages of decomposition. So now the rule of thumb for our postmortem interval, right? So if the body feels warm and it's flaccid, right? So that means it is not gone to full rigor mortis. You can say that the victim is less than 3 hours, right? The postmortem interval, the time from discovery, from death until discovery, is about 3 hours, right? Body still feels warm and rigor has not set in. If the body feels warm, but rigor has set in, right? The body is stiff. We can estimate that body has been dead about 3 to 8 hours. Now, if the body feels cold and is stiff, we're going to have a 8 to 36 hour window, right? We have a much larger window now, right? So we're going to have to use other means to kind of narrow down that postmortem interval to a time of death. And the body feels cold, and now rigor has left, right? And now it's flaccid, because that means not rigor. Now we're going to say we can be dead more than 36 hours. Can they say 40, 42, 3 days, 2 weeks? Not just with this. This is just a very general postmortem interval. All right, so death is a process that involves both individual and cell death and organism death, right? The medical and legal communities have been unable to agree upon a precise definition of death. When a person dies, it is important to establish the manner, the cause, and the mechanism of death. An exact time, since death or postmortem interval, is sometimes difficult to estimate. Shortly after death, right, the body undergoes algor, rigor, and livor mortis, right? So we have our pooling of the blood, right? So the livor mortis is the pooling of the blood. And then we have our rigor mortis, right, which is the stiffening of the body. And then we have our algor mortis, which is our temperature, right? Because those are the words that are tricky. The rate at which these occurs is affected by the environment and physical factors. The physical and chemical changes that occur after death, right, bloating, skin marbling, and adipocere formation are caused by decomposition. The process begins with autolysis of cells, right, means that the cells are breaking apart, self-destructing, followed by that putrefaction and then the total degradation of soft tissues. Autopsies are typically performed by medical examiners. During an autopsy, the medical examiner performs external and internal examinations, images various pertinent body regions, right? Images like x-rays or MRIs, right? And x-rays can be able to see bone and other very dense objects, and an MRI is going to be able to see flesh, softer flesh. Removes and weighs the organs, right? So then that's very important, right? You're going to remove each and every organ, including the brain, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, and they're going to weigh each of those. And then they're going to take tissue and fluid samples and they're going to save those, right? Those can get run to the lab. You can do toxicology, DNA, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Eye, stomach, liver, and brain. To estimate the postmortem interval, evidence is compiled from the body, the environment, the autopsy findings, and the person's social contacts if necessary. The postmortem interval is never precise. Okay, so the postmortem interval is never precise because of the many environmental factors, but you can narrow it down basically to a window of time, right? The postmortem interval, the window of time from when a body is discovered until from the time of death until the body has been discovered. Okay, and that is the end, but I want to make sure I go back to, and I want to go back one more spot here where we have our autopsies. Let me go from current slide. Okay, let me make sure I've got my pen because I wanted to make sure I pointed out one thing. Autopsies are performed by medical examiners, but one of the vocab words was coroner. Okay, so a coroner is an elected official. And so it's not the same thing as a medical examiner, right? So you have a medical examiner or a coroner, and that's going to vary from state to state. But a coroner is an elected official and doesn't necessarily have to be a medical professional. But a medical examiner is an MD, right? That is somebody who went to medical school and has become a medical examiner. A coroner is usually a medical doctor, but it doesn't have to be, again, because that's an elected official. All right, so until our next notes when we get into bones, I will see you next time.